November 25, 1943. A 41-year-old U.S. Navy commander received orders to intercept a Japanese destroyer convoy, the same elite night fighting force that had slaughtered American ships for 2 years straight in the pitch-black waters of the South Pacific. His staff thought he'd lost his mind when he ordered full speed directly at the enemy, abandoning every tactical rule in the Navy playbook, a move so reckless that veterans called it suicidal. But what happened in the next 30 minutes didn't just sink 3 Japanese destroyers without losing a single American ship. It revealed a psychological weapon the U.S. Navy had been too terrified to use. So how did one man's impossible decision transform the U.S. from the hunted into the most feared destroyer force in naval history? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. November 1943, the Solomon Islands, a place where the ocean itself had turned into a graveyard. American sailors had given it a new name, Iron Bottom Sound. They called it that because so many ships lay at the bottom, torn apart by Japanese torpedoes in the dead of night. More than 50 vessels rested on the seafloor, their metal bones scattered across sand and coral. Inside those wrecks were the bodies of thousands of young men who never made it home. The Pacific War was not going well for the United States Navy. Not at night, never at night. When the sun went down over these dark waters, the Japanese owned everything. Their destroyers moved like ghosts through the blackness, striking without warning, vanishing before American guns could even rotate to fire back. Their torpedoes were faster, deadlier, and could hit targets from miles away. The Type 93 Long Lance torpedo carried 1,000 pounds of explosives and left almost no wake. By the time you saw it coming, you were already dead. American destroyer crews knew the odds. If they encountered Japanese destroyers after sunset, they would probably die. It was that simple. The statistics proved it. In the naval battles around Guadalcanal, American ships had been crushed again and again in night combat. The Battle of Savo Island, the Battle of Tassafaranga, the Battle of Columbanga. Each name represented hundreds of sailors burning alive in fuel-soaked water or drowning as their ships broke in half and sank in minutes. The problem was not courage. American sailors were brave. The problem was doctrine, the way the Navy had been taught to fight. Before the war, the U.S. Navy had trained for daylight battles, big gun battles, battleships firing at other battleships from miles away in clear weather. Night fighting was considered too dangerous, too chaotic. Better to wait until morning when you could see what you were shooting at. This thinking had been drilled into every officer at the Naval Academy. It was written in every manual. It was the safe way, the careful way, the way that got you promoted. But careful was getting people killed. The Japanese had spent years perfecting night combat. Their destroyers practiced in darkness until every maneuver became instinct. Their lookouts trained their eyes to see in conditions that left Americans blind. They understood that the side that struck first in a night battle almost always won. Speed and aggression were everything. Hesitation meant death. American admirals knew they had a problem, but they were slow to change. The Navy was a conservative institution. Senior officers had spent 30 years learning to fight one way, and now the war demanded they fight a completely different way. Some tried, some failed. Most played it safe, issuing cautious orders to their destroyer squadrons. Maintain formation, proceed carefully, avoid close engagement, wait for air support at dawn. These careful orders kept getting men killed. By November 1943, something had to change. The United States was pushing north through the Solomon Islands, taking back territory island by island. But the Japanese were not giving up easily. Every night, they sent fast destroyer convoys racing down a narrow channel the Americans called the Slot. These Tokyo Express runs delivered troops and supplies to Japanese garrisons, and they had to be stopped. Into this desperate situation stepped a commander who did not believe in careful. Captain Arleigh Burke was 41 years old, which made him older than most destroyer captains. He had spent years being passed over for important commands because admirals thought he was too aggressive, too willing to bend rules, too likely to cause trouble. But the Navy was running out of options and running out of commanders who knew how to win. So they gave Burke command of Destroyer Squadron 23, 8 destroyers stationed in the South Pacific with one job: stop the Tokyo Express. His crews immediately noticed something different about him. Burke moved fast, talked fast, and made decisions fast. He had earned the nickname 31-knot Burke after radioing a slower convoy to get out of his way because he was coming through at 31 knots, nearly top speed. Most commanders would have slowed down. Burke told everyone else to speed up. He spent his first weeks drilling his squadron relentlessly. Night gunnery practice, radar tracking drills, high-speed maneuvers in complete darkness. His officers were exhausted, but Burke kept pushing. He told them the Japanese had been winning because the Japanese practiced more, trained harder, and fought meaner. If the Little Beavers, as his squadron was nicknamed, wanted to survive, they had to become better at night fighting than the enemy. Then came the intelligence report that would test everything. November 24th. A message arrived from scouts: Japanese destroyer squadron departing Rabaul. 5 destroyers escorting troop transports, heading south down the slot toward Bougainville. Expected arrival after midnight. This was a standard Tokyo Express run, the kind that had been humiliating American forces for months. Burke's orders from higher command were clear and predictable. Intercept if possible, but proceed with caution. Avoid unnecessary risk. Consider waiting for daylight air support. Burke read the orders and made a decision that shocked every officer in his wardroom. He was not going to proceed with caution. He was not going to avoid risk. He was definitely not going to wait until morning. He was going to do the one thing American doctrine said never to do against Japanese destroyers at night. He was going to attack at full speed, head-on, at point-blank range. His officers thought he had lost his mind. This was suicide. Everyone knew you did not charge Japanese destroyers in the dark. You maneuvered carefully. You tried to get position. You hoped to spot them before they spotted you. You definitely did not race straight at them at maximum speed like a bull at a red flag. But Burke saw something his officers did not see yet. He saw that fear was the real enemy. The Japanese had won so many night battles that Americans were now defeated before the first shot was fired. Caution had become cowardice. Careful had become paralysis. The only way to break the cycle was to do something so aggressive, so unexpected, so completely insane that it would catch the enemy off guard. Burke looked at his officers and said they were going in. Full speed, no hesitation. They would trust their new radar to find the enemy first. They would close to knife fighting range before the Japanese even knew they were there. And then they would unleash everything they had. The officers stared at him. Outside, the sun was setting over Iron Bottom Sound, and the darkness was coming. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The 8 destroyers of Destroyer Squadron 23 cut through black water at 31 knots. No moon, no stars. Thick clouds covered everything. The kind of darkness where you could hold your hand 6 inches from your face and see nothing. Perfect conditions for the Japanese, terrible conditions for everyone else. Burke stood on the bridge of his flagship, the USS Charles Osborne, watching the green glow of the new SG radar screen. This was the secret weapon nobody was talking about yet. Surface search radar that could spot other ships in total darkness from miles away. The Japanese did not have it. Their destroyers relied on excellent lookouts with excellent night vision, but human eyes could not compete with radio waves bouncing off metal hulls. Burke had studied the intelligence reports obsessively. He knew the Japanese destroyers would be racing south down the slot at high speed, confident in their superiority, expecting no resistance until they reached Bougainville. They had made this run dozens of times. It had become routine. Routine made people careless. At 23:30 hours, 11:30 at night, the radar operator called out contact. 5 ships bearing north, range 22,000 yards, 11 miles away. The Japanese destroyers, exactly where intelligence said they would be. Burke's officers tensed. This was it, the moment of truth. Standard doctrine said to maneuver for position, try to cross the enemy's T, set up a favorable firing angle. Take your time, be careful. But Burke had already decided there would be nothing careful about tonight. He gave the order. All ships increased to flank speed, course straight at the enemy, no maneuvering, no fancy tactics, just raw speed and violence pointed like a spear at the heart of the Japanese formation. The destroyers surged forward, their engines screaming, white water boiling behind them. 31 knots became 32. The ships shook with the strain. In the engine rooms, men worked in 120-degree heat, feeding oil to the boilers, watching pressure gauges climb into the red. On deck, gun crews loaded 5-inch shells and waited. Torpedo crews checked their Mark 15 torpedoes, inferior to the Japanese Longlance, but deadly enough at close range. The range counter spun downward, 20,000 yards, 18,000, 15,000. The Japanese still showed no sign they knew the Americans were coming. Their formation remained steady, cruising south at 26 knots, completely unaware that 8 American destroyers were racing toward them through the night like a pack of wolves. Burke watched the radar screen. His plan was simple but insane. He would close to under 3,000 yards before opening fire, less than 2 miles. In naval warfare, that was knife-fighting distance. At that range, even a mediocre gunner could hit a destroyer-sized target. The rapid-fire American 5-inch guns would overwhelm the Japanese, who had to reload manually. But it also meant the Japanese could hit back just as easily. One long-lance torpedo at that range would cut a destroyer in half. 10,000 yards, 5 miles. Burke's officers were sweating now, and it was not from the heat. They had trained for this, drilled for this, but training was different from racing through total darkness toward an enemy that had killed so many of their friends. Every man on every ship knew the names. USS Strong, sunk by torpedoes. USS De Haven, blown apart. USS Aaron Ward, crippled and burning. The list went on and on. 7,000 yards. Burke ordered his squadron to split into 2 groups. 5 destroyers with him, 3 destroyers under Captain Burke's second-in-command peeling off to attack from a different angle. The Japanese would have targets coming at them from 2 directions. Even if they spotted one group, they might miss the other. 5,000 yards, less than 3 miles now. Still no reaction from the Japanese. Their radar silence was complete. They were sailing blind, trusting their lookouts, confident that no American force would dare attack them at night. Burke felt the tension like electricity in the air. His plan was working, but working meant nothing until the shooting started. Everything could still go wrong. The radar could glitch, a Japanese lookout could spot them. An American ship could launch torpedoes too early and give away their position. 1,000 things could turn this from a brilliant ambush into a massacre. 4,000 yards. The fire control teams locked on to their targets. Guns trained out into the darkness, pointing at enemies they could not see. The men waited for the order, fingers on triggers, knowing that in seconds this quiet night would explode into chaos. 3,000 yards. Burke spoke 2 words into the radio. Open fire. The night turned white. Every gun on every American destroyer fired at once. 5-inch shells screamed across the water at 2,000 feet per second. The muzzle flashes lit up the ocean like lightning, and for one frozen moment, the Japanese destroyers were visible, caught completely by surprise, their crews still at cruising stations, unprepared for battle. The first American salvo hit 3 seconds later. Shells slammed into the lead Japanese destroyer, the Onami, punching through thin armor, exploding inside the hull. One hit the bridge, killing the captain and every officer around him instantly. Another hit the forward magazine. The ship erupted in a tower of flame that rose 200 feet into the air. The Japanese tried to react, but they were already dying. The second destroyer, Makinami, took 6 hits in the first 30 seconds. Its engine room flooded, its guns jammed. It began listing to port, taking on water, dead in the water and burning. The American destroyers kept firing. Burke had drilled his crews until loading and firing became automatic. 5 rounds per minute per gun. Each destroyer had 5 guns. That was 25 shells per minute per ship. 8 ships meant 200 shells every 60 seconds. A steel hurricane tearing through the Japanese formation. The third destroyer, Yugiri, managed to launch torpedoes, but in the chaos and confusion, they missed. American ships turned hard, their captains reacting on instinct, dodging the white wakes. One torpedo passed 50 feet from the USS Claxton. Another ran under the USS Dyson without exploding, its depth set too deep. The Japanese were outmatched, outgunned, and out of time. Burke's impossible tactic was working. The aggressive charge, the point-blank range, the overwhelming firepower. It was turning the predator into prey. For 2 years, Japanese destroyers had terrorized these waters. For 2 years, Americans had fought with fear and caution. Now the fear belonged to the Japanese, and there was nothing careful about what was happening to them. The Battle of Cape St. George lasted 31 minutes from first shot to final explosion. When it ended, 3 Japanese destroyers were sinking or already gone beneath the waves, and not a single American ship had been lost. Burke's squadron had suffered exactly 1 casualty, a single sailor wounded by shrapnel. In the entire history of night combat between American and Japanese destroyers, nothing like this had ever happened. The transformation was immediate and absolute. Officers who had thought Burke was insane now looked at him like he had discovered fire. The men who had been terrified charging into darkness now stood on deck watching Japanese survivors floundering in oil-slicked water, and they understood that something fundamental had changed. The hunters had become the hunted. The nightmare was over. Burke stood on his bridge and watched the burning wreckage drift past. He felt no joy, no celebration. 3 ships full of men were dying in the water behind him, and death was never something to celebrate. But he felt vindication. For years, the Navy had told him he was too aggressive, too reckless, too willing to ignore the rules. Now those rules lay at the bottom of Iron Bottom Sound along with all the American ships that had followed them. The radio crackled with reports from his other ships. Minimal damage, full ammunition remaining, all systems operational, ready to continue the fight. Burke smiled at that last part. His crews were not just surviving anymore, they were hunting. The fear that had paralyzed American destroyer forces for 31 minutes had evaporated in 31 minutes. But the real transformation was happening in the minds of his officers. In the wardrooms and on the bridges of 8 American destroyers, men were replaying the battle in their heads and realizing that everything they had been taught was wrong. Caution did not save lives. Caution got you killed because it gave the enemy time to kill you first. Aggression, properly applied with superior technology and training, was the safest tactic of all. Commander Frederick Moosebrugger, captain of the USS Spence, put it simply over the radio. "We trained harder than they did. We trusted our equipment, and we hit them before they knew we existed. That's the formula. That's how we win every time." Burke understood what was happening. He was watching doctrine change in real time. For decades, the Navy had worshipped at the altar of careful tactics and measured responses. But careful tactics were designed by men who had never faced Japanese long-lance torpedoes in total darkness. Those men had died learning that their tactics were obsolete. Burke and his little beavers had survived by throwing the obsolete tactics away and replacing them with something the Japanese never expected. American destroyers that fought like Japanese destroyers, only better. The radar made the difference. Burke knew this. The SG surface search radar gave his ships eyes in the darkness that the Japanese could not match. But radar alone was not enough. Plenty of American ships had radar and still got sunk. The real weapon was the willingness to use the advantage aggressively, to see the enemy first and then charge straight at them at maximum speed, closing to point-blank range before they could react. It required nerve. It required trust in your equipment and your crew. Most of all, it required abandoning the safety of doctrine and accepting that the boldest move was often the smartest move. In his personal journal that night, Burke wrote words that would later become famous. "The Japanese owned the night because we gave it to them. We respected their superiority in night combat so much that we made it real. Once we stopped being afraid and started being aggressive, they had no answer. Their tactics required us to be cautious. When we refused to be cautious, their entire system collapsed." News of the victory spread through the fleet like electricity. Other destroyer squadrons demanded to know Burke's tactics. What did he do differently? How did he train his men? What was the secret? Burke's answer frustrated them because it was so simple. There was no secret. Train harder. Use your radar. Close fast. Shoot first. Do not hesitate. Do not be careful. Be violent and decisive and overwhelming. Some officers still resisted. They argued that Burke had been lucky, that his tactic would not work against a more alert enemy, that charging at full speed was still fundamentally reckless. Burke let his record speak for itself. Over the next months, Destroyer Squadron 23 would fight in 8 more engagements. They would sink more enemy ships than any other destroyer squadron in the entire war. They would do it using the same aggressive tactics, refined and perfected, but fundamentally unchanged from that first night at Cape St. George. The Japanese tried to adapt. They knew something had changed in American tactics. Their after-action reports spoke of American destroyers that attacked with unexpected ferocity and suicidal speed. But knowing something had changed and stopping it were two different things. The Americans now had both technological superiority and tactical superiority. The Japanese had spent years perfecting night combat against cautious enemies. They had no answer for enemies that were more aggressive than they were. Burke's philosophy spread through the Navy like a virus. Young officers who served under him became captains themselves and took his lessons with them. Aggressive night attacks became standard procedure. Closing to point-blank range was no longer considered crazy. It was considered smart. The transformation was so complete that by 1944, American destroyers actively hunted Japanese destroyers at night, seeking them out rather than avoiding them. The ideological collapse was not limited to tactics. Burke had proven something deeper and more important. He had proven that institutional knowledge could be wrong, that the safe way could be the dangerous way, that sometimes the rulebook needed to be thrown out completely. The Navy was a conservative organization that valued tradition and procedure, but Burke had shown that tradition and procedure could kill you if they were based on outdated assumptions. His officers understood this now. They had seen it work. They had survived because their commander was willing to reject everything the Navy had taught him and trust his own judgment instead. That lesson would echo through military history for decades. The best commanders were not the ones who followed the rules. The best commanders were the ones who understood when the rules no longer applied and had the courage to write new ones. Burke later reflected that the real enemy at Cape St. George was not the Japanese destroyers. The real enemy was American fear and American caution. The Japanese were just better at night fighting until Americans decided to be better. Once that decision was made, once the fear was replaced with trained aggression and technological advantage, the outcome was inevitable. The impossible had become routine, and the destroyer killers had become the killed. The war ended in August 1945. Burke returned to the United States as one of the most decorated destroyer commanders in naval history. He had fought in 22 separate engagements. His squadron had sunk more enemy ships than any other destroyer unit in the Pacific. He had done it by breaking every rule the Navy had taught him, and now the Navy wanted him to teach others how to break rules the right way. Burke walked the streets of Washington in his dress uniform, and people recognized him. They had read about the little beavers in the newspapers. They knew about Cape St. George and the impossible charge through darkness that had turned the tide of the destroyer war. But Burke did not feel like a hero. He felt like someone who had figured out something obvious that everyone else had missed. The Japanese were not invincible. They had just been fighting scared opponents. Once the opponents stopped being scared, the Japanese lost. The post-war Navy was different from the Navy Burke had joined as a young officer. That old Navy had worshipped battleships and big guns and careful tactics. The new Navy understood that the next war would be fought with aircraft carriers, submarines, guided missiles, and commanders willing to take risks. Burke had proven that aggression and technology could defeat tradition and numbers. That lesson was now being written into every training manual and taught at every naval academy. In 1955, Burke was appointed Chief of Naval Operations, the highest position in the United States Navy. He was 54 years old. Most CNOs served 2 years and retired. Burke served 6 years, longer than anyone before or since. He used that time to transform the Navy completely. He pushed for nuclear-powered ships. He championed guided missile technology. He built the Polaris submarine-launched ballistic missile system that would become the backbone of American nuclear deterrence during the Cold War. But more than any specific weapon system, Burke changed how the Navy thought about warfare itself. His philosophy was simple and radical. Speed and decisiveness win wars. Hesitation and caution lose them. The side that strikes first with overwhelming force almost always wins. Technology is useless if you are too afraid to use it aggressively. These ideas seem obvious now, but in the 1950s they were revolutionary. Burke had to fight his own admirals, men who still believed in careful tactics and measured responses. Men who had never charged through darkness at 31 knots toward an enemy that could kill them. Burke won those fights because he had the record to back up his philosophy. He had the dead Japanese destroyers. He had the statistics. He had the survivors who were alive because their commander refused to be cautious. When conservative admirals argued for slower, safer approaches, Burke would ask them a simple question: "How many ships did you sink?" The question usually ended the argument. The legacy Burke built was not just tactical, it was cultural. He created a Navy where aggressive junior officers were promoted instead of punished, where commanders were expected to take calculated risks instead of playing it safe, where technology was seen as an advantage to be exploited, not a tool to be used carefully. These ideas seem obvious now, but in the 1950s they were revolutionary. Burke had to fight his own admirals, men who still believed in careful tactics and measured responses, men who had never charged through darkness at 31 knots toward an enemy that could kill them. Burke won those fights because he had the record to back up his philosophy. He had the dead Japanese destroyers. He had the statistics. He had the survivors who were alive because their commander refused to be cautious. When conservative admirals argued for slower, safer approaches, Burke would ask them a simple question: "How many ships did you sink?" The question usually ended the argument. The legacy Burke built was not just tactical, it was cultural. He created a Navy where aggressive junior officers were promoted instead of punished, where commanders were expected to take calculated risks instead of playing it safe, where technology was seen as an advantage to be exploited, not a tool to be used carefully. The modern United States Navy, The most powerful naval force in human history is built on the foundation Burke created in those 6 years as CNO. In 1961, Burke retired from active duty. He was 60 years old. He could have disappeared into quiet retirement, but the Navy would not let him. They named an entire class of destroyers after him. The Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer became the backbone of the surface fleet. These ships are still being built today, more than 60 years after Burke retired. They are the most successful destroyer design in history, with over 70 ships constructed and more on the way. Every single one carries Burke's name and his legacy. Burke lived another 35 years after retirement. He gave speeches, he wrote articles, he advised younger officers, and he always told them the same thing. The impossible is only impossible if you believe it is. The Japanese destroyers were the best in the world until Americans decided they were not. The difference between victory and defeat was not weapons or numbers. It was mindset. It was the willingness to reject conventional wisdom and do what needed to be done, even if everyone else said it was crazy. In his final interview before his death in 1996 at age 94, Burke was asked what he learned from his time in the Pacific. His answer was immediate. "I learned that fear is more dangerous than the enemy." The Japanese had better torpedoes, better training, better night fighting doctrine. But once we stopped being afraid of them, once we attacked them with the same aggression they used on us, they collapsed. They had built their entire tactical system around the assumption that we would be cautious. When we stopped being cautious, they had no backup plan. Burke was asked if he ever regretted the aggressive tactics that had killed so many Japanese sailors. He paused for a long time before answering. "War is killing. That is what it is. My job was to kill the enemy before they killed my men. I did that job. The tactics I used saved American lives. If I had been cautious, if I had followed the old rules, my sailors would have died instead. I sleep fine at night, knowing I brought my men home alive." The interviewer asked one final question. What should people today learn from Cape St. George? Burke smiled, the same smile his officers remembered from that night in 1943 when he ordered the impossible charge. People should learn that the experts are often wrong, that the safe way is sometimes the most dangerous way, that boldness, backed by training and technology, defeats caution every single time. The world tells you to be careful, to follow the rules, to not take risks. Sometimes the world is right, but sometimes the world is wrong, and the only way to find out is to ignore it and do what you know is right. Burke died knowing he had changed naval warfare forever. His tactics are still taught. His ships still sail. His name is still spoken with reverence in every naval academy in the world. The ultimate destroyer killer was not a weapon or a ship. It was a mindset, a philosophy, a willingness to do the impossible because no one else had the courage to try. And it all started with one commander who looked at darkness and death and decided to charge straight into it at 31 knots. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.